Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to commend Senator Whitehouse on this point with respect to efficiency in the healthcare system. This is clearly an area where I think Democrats and Republicans can work together. You look, for example, at chronic care, which is responsible for 70% of the Medicare bill in this country, and it is so fragmented and so poorly coordinated. This ought to be an area where we can work together. I want to work with the senator, and I think the senator from Wisconsin knows I'm also interested in this idea of involving the consumer. Let's just make sure we don't put at risk the vulnerable and the low income, and we'll talk about that. I want to ask about this issue of revenue, and Senator Murray is absolutely right on this point that with $1 trillion of tax expenditures, and that's really the only way to describe them, they are spending. This is a place where clearly we ought to make some changes, and that will be beneficial to our country and to, I think, a more rational set of priorities. I want to ask about something else on the tax code, though, with respect to generating revenue. And y'all at Brookings and at CAP have helped me a lot on tax reform, essentially, over the last decade. I think you go back through your history. Rahm Emanuel and I introduced a bill where we couldn't even get a Republican on the bill. You all stayed with us, and others. And finally, the former ranking member, Senator Gregg, worked with us for several years. We were able to get that bill in. And one of the key features we picked up along the way is that central to reform and generating more revenue in a consumer-driven economy is the role of the middle class and the middle class person, because that middle class person who right now is hard-pressed in terms of getting by is the person who goes into the economy, makes a decision, for example, about remodeling their place, buys goods and services. It's the old Henry Ford argument, is he wanted to do well, but for him to do well, his people had to be able to buy his cars, and those kind of purchases helped our economy and helped us create a middle-class way of life in our country and help government and generated revenue and allowed us to fund our priorities. In that regard, we have been able to get bipartisan support for the idea of tripling the standard deduction, which means, in effect, if you're making $60,000 in the economy today, we're putting off limits $30,000. Essentially, we're putting $3,000, somewhere in that vicinity, of permanent tax relief into the pockets of the middle-class person. Both of your organizations, and ma'am, I have not had a chance to work with you in the past, so I don't want you to feel that I'm ignoring you just for any other reason. We've worked with these two organizations in the past. Talk a little bit about how expanding opportunities for middle-class people in an economy where the consumer is driving about 50% plus of economic activity can help us create jobs and generate the additional revenue, which our chair, Senator Murray, has correctly identified as something we ought to focus on doing. So either of you gentlemen in particular, and be happy to have you add a thought as well. But your organizations, since you assisted us in the past, we'll try to get your thoughts this afternoon.
Thank you, Senator. That's an excellent question, and I think it hits it right on the head that if we want to see broader economic growth, we want to see faster economic growth, which will then generate more revenue, we have to focus on the middle class. That really is where the drivers for economic growth come from. And I mentioned in my testimony all the different ways the middle class is really integral to economic growth. So when we consider tax reform, we should really think about ways in which we can make the code more efficient for the middle class and also for those who aspire to get into the middle class, people who are working to get into the middle class. How do we build those ladders up into the middle class and improve on economic mobility? Because I agree very much with my colleague that economic mobility is a very important factor here. The Center for American Progress, for example, put out a tax reform plan in December.
A very good one.
Well, thank you very much. We had some impressive co-authors, including Bob Rubin and Larry Summers and John Podesta and Neera Tanden. That proposal included something similar. We proposed a very large standard credit.
Right.
to do something similar, which is remove a whole portion of income from people from taxation. We prefer the credit system rather than the deduction system because deductions are by their nature upside down. They benefit those at the top more than people in the middle. So things like that move the system to consider middle-class needs, I think, is where we should go.
Well said, Mr. Linden.
Thank you, Senator. So you started your question with the discussion of tax expenditures, and I think that's a great place to start as well. That's an issue where, to paraphrase Martin Feldstein, if Republicans want to cut spending and if Democrats want to include a mix of revenues and spending cuts, then tax expenditures are a great place to start. You know, there's spending that occur through the tax code. There's a lot of them. There's opportunity to rein them in. And there's probably opportunities to do it in a way that simplifies the tax code, gets people off from filing complicated returns, just as raising the standard deduction would. And so I think it's a very promising approach, and I hope we pursue it.
Very good. Thank you, Madam Chair.